looks like we're recording. Sweet. So for the most part, we pretty much stopped here last time. I think we got to the sky. We talked a little bit about some of the swatches and things like that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the swatches, but they need to be really light. They don't need to be the actual focus or the texture of things to be the actual focus. And really a mixture between texture and color could be useful, right, for sure. And arguably color's a little bit easier to work with. You can start to scheme it, and it starts to give more of a cartoon pastel look to our architectural rendering. In my case, I started fooling around with things last night, and of course what I want to teach you today is kind of the end product right now. So of course I want to show you how you can put the back layer of things. And as I was mentioning, we can start to draw some entourage. Like for instance, I just sort of freehand drew this one, and that's actually pretty nice, right? To be fair, arguably it would take me a little bit longer even in Rhino. So I was finding some things last night and some useful tools that I of course wanted to show you guys. Of course, trees make a huge difference and actually have quite a bit of tutorial to show in working with some of those files that you get from Pin My Drawings, right? Just to make those a little bit easier. And as you guys know, you're probably getting very familiar with release mask and ungrouping things and constantly expanding things, especially in this program, where it's starting to become second nature for myself, but definitely a learning curve. Especially if you're used to Rhino, Revit, AutoCAD, and any other program. Arguably, Illustrator seems to be actually quite a bit different. So it's definitely going to take some practice, but once you get some scale figures, some shadows, and arguably even some clouds in there, we don't even need the background for this, and we start to get a really nice cartoon look to our drawing. So this is more or less kind of the finished product, and I want to go over a little bit of shadows, entourage, some of the drawing tools that I found. And to be fair, the shadows is really what pops any elevational drawing, right? And of course scale figures to suddenly activate the drawing. Another thing that's pretty nice is once you of course have all these things sort of set, you can go back and actually change some things. For instance, some people like white scale figures, some people like black scale figures, some people like realistic scale figures. I like them actually with the least amount of detail possible. That way, they're not so focused on the person's face rather than actually where they are in relation to the architecture and things like that. But just to get right into it, I'm basically just going to remake some of these elements that you see right here. So kind of as a final instruction. And what's really nice is, to be fair, I just looked on Pinterest and looked up some other ideas of what people were doing to see if I could mimic some of those things. So let's go. So I'm going to turn off some of this stuff and kind of start from scratch, or realistically where we were in part 1. So let's turn some of this stuff off. Trees, ramps, I guess we can keep ramps. Walls, I guess we can keep walls. Floors, yeah, we need floors. Railing, yep. I think we had that last time. Windows, concrete, scale figures, we'll turn those off. Shadows, and our clouds. And it's a pretty bare, flat drawing. Not really a lot of information coming about or really happening there. One thing I did want to mention, just because I was finding it really useful using, that once I had all of these in a layer and that I had them at the right line weight that I wanted them, don't get me wrong, I'm not a huge fan of Live Paint tool, and you guys might not be either, but the good news is there's actually many ways to use this program, and to be fair, you don't always have to use the Live Paint tool. It is useful in some cases, but for the most part it's always going to group and turn it into one layer, which is really annoying, right? But there's there's a lot of people who complain about this, so I'm not sure what Illustrator's deal is, but it still works as a great program. But let's talk about shadows first, because I do think they're probably the most important. So I'm going to go ahead and make another shadow layer and call it shadow number 2. And go ahead and lock everything else because, well, I don't want to accidentally click on it, or the pen tool is actually kind of weird. If you click on another layer, it'll start to turn into that layer. And without a lengthy, to be fair, I don't really know why it does that, but I guess maybe to make it easier for other illustrators. But let's get some shadows on here because for the most part, we're just going to have to fake it till we make it. And based on some of the things that we already know about our G1 and G2 shadows, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click on that shadow layer and make sure that it's activated. I'm going to go hit the pen tool or the letter P, right? And of course it's going to bring up this pen tool. Now in my case, I probably want to give it some sort of, you know, quality that's already close to what I'm going for. So maybe a darkish purple. Press OK. And then of course my essentials, classic tools is always a given. Definitely want those. And I'm going to go for actually half opacity. I'm just going to set it up from the beginning. You know, normally in Photoshop we wouldn't even do that, but this is actually the game changer. So as you can see, it wants to lock onto certain things, but thankfully all of our layers, they're of course locked. And I do want to kind of set these up again. There we go. Properties is definitely a very useful panel, and you know, the more and more I work in Illustrator, the bigger this panel gets, because it really does control a lot of the drawing. And the bigger screen real estate that you have is definitely worth it. I'd start working on the double screen computers, really would. Anyway, so let's draw it. Let's get some of those pieces. As we know, this overhang, right, we're not going to have a shadow in the middle of the sky. That would be ridiculous, right? So in fact, I mean, it's still going to cast a shadow, but we're not going to see that shadow till about here. So you kind of see I kind of fake it till I make it. I mean, don't get me wrong, technically we could draw a line, we can get it ever so perfect, but not to waste time, right? And we can assume that it's actually going to be in a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to hold shift, and it's going to stay even at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to assume that this piece is actually jutting out towards us. So I'm going to bring up the shadow line just a little bit. And you'll see that unlike, like say, Rhino or Revit or anything like that, it doesn't really have a snapping. You have to be particularly zoomed in and careful, right? So I'm going to bring up that shadow a little bit. I'm going to say that it comes back down to this area, right? And it even lines up to the previous pieces, which is nice. I want to get technical, so you know, I know that these are mullions. I know that they jut up a little bit, so I'm going to do my best to make that accordingly. And I'm going to fake it till I make it. You know, I'm not going to be too detailed, but when it gets closer to the window itself, and of course I'm holding shift the entire time so that it stays in a straight line. So something like that. And again, just kind of faking it till I make it. Not a big deal. Let's say that goes even further. And as long as I'm basically staying even, should be okay. But yes, we're drawing the shadows by hand. So it will take some previous information or knowledge about shadows. And to be fair, on the next one, I'll show you kind of the easier way. This is definitely the most detailed way, but I do think it yields the best results. And it looks most realistic. And we're done, right? At least with that level. It'll go up to the overhang, of course. So I'll have it stretch all the way across. And it'll basically end on the elevation itself. We'll click on where we started from the begin with and close it. Now we can select it as an object, and it looks like I may have stopped on my fill. That's okay. We can start to really get a nice shadow about this though. Realistically, starting to make this pop a lot more, and arguably maybe a little bit too far. Maybe I covered the windows just a little too much. So what's nice, and what I've learned actually, is that there's two kind of selection tools in Illustrator. One is a direct, which means basically it'll select the outmost object. So for instance, it'll select, you know, that piece that we just made. And the direct selection tool, right, it'll actually get the points. This is very familiar to F10 on Rhino, right? It'll release all the points and suddenly you can change things, right? And what's nice about that is, well, if I need to lift up all of these points, right, it's kind of nice. I can just get all of these points, quite literally make sure that I grab one, right, and of course move it. Now in my case, I need to select the object first. And you can even double click on an object to specifically edit it. So like in my direct object tool, if I double click, it'll sort of isolate it and already bring it kind of into this mode. I can use my direct select tool, select all the points that I want to bring up, And just make sure that I select one of those points that I selected, right? So in my case, make sure I get one. Oh, I didn't actually get it. But I can bring those points up individually. You can bring them up at the same time too. One sec. Direct, highlight them all. Sweet. We can actually use our arrow tools for this one. So, I mean, kind of nice that there's an editing process. It's almost like somebody tried to add Rhino to Photoshop in a way, is at least the way that I'm starting to take it. But that's starting to look a little bit nicer. It's starting to show a harsher angle of the sun, and it gives more depth to the elevation. So when you're done isolated mode, you of course can use direct and double click outside of it, and it'll return back to normal. But that's pretty nice. And to be fair, we can hold Alt on Windows or Option on the Mac, and we can instantly copy something. That's actually kind of a nice tool. I wish Rhino had something like that. But you know, once I do one, I mean, why work harder when I can work smarter? I can just do that for each level. Now you'll notice some things that are wrong with it, especially those little details that I gave it. But we can fix those as well with the direct selection tool. So I have those pieces, but you'll notice there's kind of some funny anomalies, you know, going on. So I may need to move those. I may just need to actually change it. So I can double click again so that I can edit this directly. I can't tell you how much of an awesome tool that is, just to double click on something. That way I don't accidentally click on something else, which is so easy to do in Illustrator. Sorry, gotta say Indian style. So we can use that direct tool, and I can further edit things. I can even delete them too and still keep and maintain the model. So like, say for instance, I didn't need all these pieces right here. I can delete them, turns it back into a straight line. Again, really useful. I don't have to draw all of that over again, right? Now you'll notice I can't just like select the piece still. It'll still accidentally select it. So you'll notice when I select something, I go outside of the box and select in. That way, of course, I can delete some of these points that I don't need. However, if I delete too many points, not a big deal. I'll go back to my pen tool and I'll right click on it, and you'll see that there's add points and delete points. Now, to be fair, it's really easy to delete a point. Just select it, delete it. But to add one, you'll actually need this add tool, and it assumes that it's adding to one that's already there. So for instance, you'll see that it immediately pops up to a line. Let's zoom in a little bit to see that. So say I want to add to this point, you'll see that it wants to show you where to mark, right? It'll even start to line up with other things, which is pretty nice. In our case, it'll say, please use the anchor point to the segment of the path. There you go, right? But what's nice is now I can manipulate these points with my direct tool. Be very careful. The direct tool is actually the one that you want to get these very specific points. So I'll change that. Again, you click on the point first, then move it. It's very annoying, I know, but you do get used to it. And yeah, in some of these cases, obviously I just don't need those anymore, right? Or maybe I move them, right? So for instance, I could still take my direct tool, take those pieces, and move them, right? Or even get rid of the ones that I don't need. And to be fair, that is pretty quick, right? I mean, compared to Photoshop where, you know, normally we would brush that in and things like that. So right off the bat, we've already got some shadows, and we're adding a lot of depth to that. But what's even better is, even if I didn't like it, I can select all of the shadows and of course change them, right? And even preview them at the same time. It is kind of a game changer. You know, if I wanted a warmer light, you know, I could go towards, you know, sort of an orange. Right, maybe it's a very hot day and I really want to get that across. Maybe it's moonlight and I actually, you know, want it to be a little bit more crimson, right? Right, Leo? Because you can still have shadows at night.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So maybe they're a little bit softer and things like that. So anyway, there's shadows. And clearly a game changer. I'm going to leave them pretty dark so that you guys can see them in the projector pretty well. And on the preview. Anyway, last but not least, I want to get a shadow down here. I learned by looking at this building a little bit more and just kind of making some artistic license that there's probably shadow underneath here, and it's on a raised plinth just because this column pretty much goes all the way down to the line. So again, I just go to my shadow layer. Everything else is locked, so I'm kind of in a nice zone now. I'm not so afraid, and I don't feel that like the program's in control rather than me, which you should totally be in control of your programs. So I'm just gonna draw and fill in kind of the rest. Close it, sweet. Go back to Direct Tool and start another one. I can hit P for the pen tool and make this process a little bit faster. To be fair, that's a rectangle. I could just use a rectangle tool, but I don't know, the pen tool is pretty nice. What I do like about it is it kind of makes these anomalies that I can either decide to leave there or move them, right? I can get my Direct Tool and just slightly change them too. That is pretty annoying going back and forth between these. Keep in mind they do have a command as well, but they don't work when you're in the text mode. They'll start typing the letters, not the command, right? But the letter V and the letter A is actually really good to start to get used to, because I can select V, select A, select V, A, V, A, V, A, a lot faster than going up there all the time just to click on it. However, if you're using text, it can get quite annoying. Another thing is the eyedropper tool. It didn't work so well with the live paint, but that's okay. We'll select these two pieces. I'll hit the letter I and quite literally just select the previous shadow layer that we had. And voila, we got the exact same settings. And to be fair, that's pretty nice too. So we have some shadow underneath our building, and now that ramp really pops, right? Already, a much better drawing than what we had last time. Moving on, I showed clouds a little bit last time, and I think this is a really good representation to show you this tool. Normally I say in all my past videos, unfortunately, they say don't draw in Illustrator. And for the first time ever, I'm gonna change that. You can totally draw in Illustrator. In fact, it's kind of nice, especially if you're already used to freehand and you know about the kind of sketchiness that you wanna have in an architectural drawing. To be fair, my clouds still look digital, right? But there is sort of this this quality about them, and let me unlock them, of course. I'm gonna go ahead and lock my shadows. In fact, I kind of get used to just locking things because it's so easy to unlock and relock them, right? All you gotta do is click and hold down, and of course move. That is pretty useful. I really wish Rhino would get on board on that one. But again, this really wavy line, I drew it by hand with my mouse, of course. Now, I know drawing with the mouse can actually be quite a difficult task too, but this is what I found pretty cool. So I'm gonna unlock my background and display it. But essentially what I did is just traced my clouds, right, from actually the cloud that I already had. So I'm gonna unlock my background so you can see it a little bit better and select it, my tool. I want to change the fill though. That way you can kind of see what I traced. Don't need that one really. That's the one we want. And we'll fill it up a little bit more. Oh, that's the background that I had. Forgot I had two of them in there. So we had one that was actually an image, and then we tried a gradient last time. So obviously I still have both of those. So there's the one that I actually traced from, and not sure why I can't give it some more opacity. There we go. And as you can see, I really just traced the sky that we already had. So I think a lot of us realized on Monday, especially myself, that the background was way too saturated, right? We don't need that much sky. And even if we do leave the sky, we almost want it to be just a light blue and slight colors, right? Because it messed so much with the architecture of what was going on. Similar to what you see now, it's really competing with the architecture. So I'd have to bring it down to like 11% to even be something print worthy, right? And to be fair, that actually prints pretty well. But it is like 11%. But at least in this next tutorial piece I wanted to show you, I'm gonna actually unlock these clouds and make a new cloud layer, bring it to the top. Because of course, clouds are at the very top. They're on top of the page. Oh. Let's call it clouds 2. And we'll go ahead and lock the other one and the background file that we want to draw from. So another thing that's nice about this is you can work on one thing at a time. I can erase everything else. I don't really have to worry about everything else. So setting up your workspace can really make this process a lot easier. But let's go ahead and lock my background so that I can start drawing on it with my Cloud 2 layer. Now, For the next one, I've never actually used this tool, but it's called the pencil tool. You'll notice that it's right under the shapes, right? And you actually have to find it a little bit. So you'll see that it's in the shape tool and it's known as your pencil tool, or the letter N. Again, I have no idea who like named the shortcuts for these, but yeah, letter N, pencil, I guess. Anyway, if you double click on that pencil, it'll actually bring up some options. So we can control the fidelity of it. And personally, I found that last night I really like the inaccurate or slightly more accurate look to it because it makes a shakier line. And so check this out. With these settings, I'm basically just going to press OK and start tracing some of my shadows, or sorry, my clouds that I see here. And I'm going to be whimsical with it, just like I would in freehand too, right? So give it a little choppiness, bring it back. You know, maybe there's a little detail there, detail there, detail there, and basically just bring it back to this line. But what's nice is it's actually going to solve some of that for us. You guys see that? I didn't really draw it that way, but it kind of gives it this nice human character that we're familiar with. Now, obviously, its default is at 1 point, so I'm going to change it to something more like 0.2. But to be fair, it starts to be this blend between digital and analog, right? Now, if you have a Wacom tablet, now, shoot, you know, Illustrator is your oyster, and it's actually much more like Morpholio, or what's the other one on the iPad? It's really good. Cat uses it.
SketchUp?
Not SketchUp. Not Morpholio. It's like Procreate. Procreate, thank you. But yeah, you know, it's actually very similar. Illustrator seems to be a lot actually similar to that program in that regard, a little bit more technical. But again, now I have a cloud that I can honestly shape. Now, I'd have to keep going, right? So, of course, I can just start a new piece, just keep drawing. And I found that this was actually a lot faster than, say, tracing some of this stuff in Rhino. Now, to be fair, they're not straight lines, so I don't really have to worry so much. In fact, that's exactly what I'm going for, is a non-straight line. I noticed that it also is dictated by the speed that I draw it. So if I take my time, it comes out a little bit more sketchy. If I go really fast, it seems a little smoother. Again, I can click on and try more smooth, right? But to be fair, what's nice is instead of just trying to not make 2D, live paint or image trace, because to be fair, we could image trace this too, which is a whole nother ball game. I don't even know if I want to show you guys that. But it is pretty nice, right? Being able to use the pencil tool. And to be fair, the pencil tool is a little bit more, it's still pretty digital, but I don't know. I don't know about you, but I like the little bit more accuracy, because again, I'm using a shakier hand to of course do those things. But of course, once we have that, I can turn off my background. I can select everything in the clouds and get going, right? We learned last time that we can use swatches. So, I mean, I'm still a fan of swatches. It just takes a little bit longer than hatching. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's like the same tool as some other programs, just arguably sometimes a longer way of achieving it. So let's get those swatches. There's my piece. Let's get them in there. And our wonderful swatches. Let's go with, I don't know. Actually, I saw these really good ones where they just use lines, especially on Pinterest. So I'm going to try some lines. Get those situated. And try them out. It's kind of got this Dr. Seuss 1960s like psychedelia to it. I don't know. I kind of like it. There's also vertical lines. I mean, that's very psychedelic, right? If you guys have ever seen the Magical Mystery Tour, or, you know, what is it, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, definitely clouds are illustrated in this way. But that's fair. So let's say I take something like that, and I do want to make it actually a much smaller scale. So I'm going to go with scale. I don't want to actually scale the whole object, so I'm going to turn that off. And I just want to scale it vertically by 50%. So something a little bit, you know, a little bit more line drawing, something more akin to we would do in graphics. I'm not going to give it an edge, even though I could, right? So I could take all these pieces, switch. Oh, I could make them a single color as well. And it looks like I accidentally got rid of my other piece. That's okay. We'll just go back. But I wanted to change this to maybe white, right? So you can't see it. And it starts to give a nice little blend feel, right? To say the least. But what's nice is it comes directly from our drawing as well. So all I'd have to do is turn on, some of the other information again. Our shadows 2 now. No scale figures yet. I'll show you that soon. Windows, concrete, all kinds of stuff. And we could turn those on a little bit more at a time. But one thing at a time, right? And arguably, one does make the architecture stand out more, right? One could argue that you don't necessarily need a sky background, right? Even though it is an easy tool, but it's often very easy to compete and oversaturate our drawings. So let's continue. We've got some clouds, and to be fair, I can even still move those. I don't have to keep those. And I can hold Alt again and make copies, right? And what's really nice is, of course, I can make copies for days and really start to compose my clouds and even change the size, which is arguably a little bit easier than even Rhino. I can still chop them off, right? So if I want to put some that are kind of in the building, make them a little bit smaller so they seem like they're receding behind the camera. Again, I'm going to use I can double click so I can isolate it, make it easier for myself. Go to the direct tool and quite literally delete the points that I don't need. Boom. And of course fix the ones that maybe I do need. So click and drag. Click and drag on those points. Now some of these points, they're actually curves, so it's a little hard to figure out maybe, but you eventually start to figure it out. Double click on the outside and suddenly we have a cloud behind the building. Things like that. Say the clouds are still too thick, still competing with my architecture a little bit too much. Again, I can take all the clouds and fade them. Pretty nice, right? Now it starts to maybe look a little too smoky behind my building, but yeah, arguably I can save a lot of time just by taking these pieces. I can transform them still, so I can go to Object, Transform, rotate them, shear them, all kinds of things. I personally like to reflect them so that I can get a little bit more out of them. Press OK, basically flips it around. That way it looks like, even though it's the exact same cloud, they don't know it, right? So, and I can change it up further as well. Sorry, I'm a stickler for composing clouds. That one seems a little off to me. I'll put them over here. There we go. So we got some clouds, add some of that information. Sometimes it bothers you kind of going off the page. I'll show you how to delete that as well. But just keep in mind that when you PDF something, of course it's not going to get anything outside of this white box anyway. But moving on, we need some more entourage. And to be fair, I appreciated Leo's today. He attempted to start to fill in the background, and I thought that was quite nice. But at least knowing this pencil information tool, I'm calling it entourage. So what I did last night was something a little bit more like this, right? Something more of a little cartoonish. Doesn't compete too much with the architecture, right? The architecture still pops out as the most maybe saturated thing. But the background starts to fade away, right? We sort of get minimalistic colors of our figures and things like that. We maybe get some hills in background to the back, and it starts to fade away with some lines, followed by something a little bit more dirty, like say a dirt hill kind of behind this, or even shrubbery, right? And things like that. So I'm going to turn these off and let's remake them. So pretty dry. We'll do something different today. So I'll still kind of do the same things, but let's get our layers at least in the right spot. So we'll need a trees number 2. An entourage number 2. An entourage number 2, number 2. Just kidding. I'll just call it the second. And we'll start with one at a time. We'll make some more when we need them. So let's get the background most first. And in my case, I have everything else locked. So again, not too worried. I'll even lock my clouds and can keep them there as well. The reason I want to keep them there is just so that I can use them, again, kind of as my O snap, if you will. So I just want to get some background hills. So I'm going to go Bob Ross with it and get my pencil tool. Double click to change its fidelity. keep them selected, things like that. And you can even change its tolerance too a little bit. I would work with these programs, test them out, see what works, see what doesn't work. But in my case, I'm going to go Bob Ross style and make some hills, mountains, mountain regions in the back, right? Compose it a little bit. Right, maybe we're in Colorado. We got some janky stuff. And what's nice is you can continue the drawing too. You can also hold shift to make a straight line, which is really nice. And again, I have to unclick and hold, right? And if I hold shift, it's gonna stay straight. But what's nice is you can do Command Z on these. So it is more like an action. But keep in mind, it is pretty hard to draw a straight line, especially diagonal. So you may have to zoom in. Keep in mind, you can always edit the points too. So not a big deal. Unfortunately, there's no lasso tool, something that's much more familiar to like Photoshop. But again, as long as you're holding shift, you can get straight lines, but just not maybe in the direction that you want them. It's looking good. And it kind of has like a magnet feel to it. You can kind of see that it's like dragging onto the line itself. It is honestly a little bit strange. But now we got that piece. And right now it's just an outline that has no filling. So I'm going to control its filling with something a little bit more appropriate. Maybe something to match the clouds. I don't know. Maybe I want to go for a texture feel or something like that. So let's go back to patterns, basics, and maybe a texture. I think I'm going to go a little bit scratchy, a little dark, and even go smaller than that. So I can take my object, transform, scale. And I don't want to actually shorten it or change it, just the pattern itself. So I can even change its direction or how much squished it gets. Obviously, the more squished I make it horizontally, it starts to make it look really, really tall. So I'm going to go with like, I don't know, 35%. Right? And it starts to look a little tiled, to be honest. So maybe I'll fade it back a little bit. That's okay. It starts to feel more like a texture. Right? And it starts to kind of give credence to the clouds and things like that. Although it does seem like I need more clouds, and to start to show that the clouds are sort of receding, right? And you can keep going, right? Again, I can hold Alt or Option on the Mac. Pretty sure I can make things smaller with my direct tool as well, right? So start to make it look like those clouds are really receding towards the back. Make it slightly bigger, slightly cattywampus, right? The one thing I don't like to make them do is make them look like lips, right, and things like that. Of course, as soon as I say that, you can't unsee lips, but yeah, let's have some clouds to the back. Right? And to be fair, that would be much smaller. But it's almost like we're giving it that false perspective and the nice amount of detail and hierarchy that clouds would have. There's definitely big clouds versus small clouds. Get a little anomalous in there. I like that. Sweet. But now we got some entourage, right? That works well with our building. And to be fair, we could even change it too, right? So we can take those individual points or a lot of them at a single time and further change it. Maybe it's competing with the architecture too much, so I want to move maybe some of these points out of the way. But again, we definitely have a lot more control than I had on Monday, so that's always kind of nice. I like 2 layers of background. I mean, don't get me wrong, you gotta at least have one in there. But maybe there's trees, there's foliage kind of in the background that, again, normally Bob Ross would teach me about. So I'm gonna go ahead and lock that previous one, that way I can't accidentally click it. I'm gonna use my tool again and choose maybe a color this time. Maybe color and texture actually work pretty well together. I don't know. And I do want to resemble that it's some dark trees towards the distance, so I'm going to use a darker color. And basically go a little crazier, right? Act a little bit more like trees. And again, this is where my freehand really comes in handy, right? And where I know how to make some of these shapes. And don't get me wrong, I'm going pretty crazy with it, because I do want some white space in there, but at the same time, kind of indicate that the trees are, of course, far in the background. So the more anomalies that I can, usually the better. getting pretty crazy with that. That's honestly hard to achieve probably in a regular mouse or definitely a trackpad. Got to kind of do the same thing here and trace some of our architecture. I kind of like the imperfection though. You guys know me, I like the Toy Story 4 look. Adds a little bit more humanness to it. Just holding shift on these makes it a little bit easier. And of course we can complete that. Now we got that piece. Doesn't retain that color for some reason, but as you can see, it almost looks like fire right now, so I'm gonna change its color a little bit. Maybe arguably sort of like a forest green, and then really dial that back. And it starts to be a nice little feature. Probably went a little wild here, and again, I can take the direct tool and delete the ones that maybe aren't working. And that's okay. Sweet. Arguably a little bit too much there too. But you know, you don't want to delete something out of sequence. I've noticed I do that all the time. If you delete too many points, some things are no longer closed or no longer have that figure ground relationship. So just keep in mind. But we got our trees, or at least something that starts to represent trees. Now keep in mind, most of the time we're looking at our drawings this far away. That definitely starts to look like some nice trees, right? To be fair, I don't really have to do that all over again. I could, just because of how easy it was. But again, I can hold Alt or Option on the Mac and even double it up, right? If I wanted to, you know, change it up a little bit more and really increase the trees by 2. Let's keep going though, right? But again, keep in mind that it's not competing with the architecture so much, and it starts to look even a little bit different now that our architecture is colored and most of our entourage is textured. Now just keep in mind that you want to start to develop some sort of style, and you got to start off somewhere, right? So in my case, at least for the tutorial, I want to show you both, right? Now, arguably, I'd still say this is pretty plasticky, but absolutely something that you would do actually in the field. So like if you worked at a firm, I was definitely always that guy that goes, here Chris, we need something for the client, and I really need a nice elevation. In fact, even in my design company, I get hired by other architects going, hey, I have this ice house, and you know, could I pay you $500 for an elevation? Great, I need 4 of them. Sweet. You know, $2,000 for honestly doing stuff that I would have done in school anyway, right? So again, these skills are what you make them and eventually add to your portfolio and why you get hired in the first place. Oh, I really like your style. I'm gonna hire you. So again, this is the kind of stuff that you do want to have in your portfolio as well. But we got some entourage. Let's get some trees next. We had some trees last time, but I want to try some different trees because I don't know, these kind of look like kind of like an Illustrator book to me, like really textbook, kind of fake, almost too fake, right? Even though I really appreciate the scale and things like that, but I do want to show you that there's a ton of things that we can do with scale figures and trees. So let's jump out of the hole for a second and get into something a little bit more specific. So I'll turn off my trees there and go ahead and open up, pretty sure I saved it. Please hope to God, oh yeah, scale figures. So this is something I was working on last night. So essentially, one thing I realized that really sucks is to do this over and over again, one at a time. Now, to be fair, I haven't really figured out how to do this all at once, at least with Pimp My Drawings. And to be honest, you could actually take a picture of yourself, put it into Illustrator, use the pencil tool, and trace yourself. What better says that you know this program than have your own scale figure that's based on literally everybody in your studio? How cool would that be? But, of course, takes some time. But what's nice about Illustrator is that we only have to do this once. So you'll notice that I even saved my own file called scale figure file, right? So I really downloaded all the ones that I found appropriate or that I even enjoyed and put them into one Illustrator file. That way I can change some things and see if they were actually on the same layers or anything like that. Unfortunately, Pimp My Drawings, these are free, you know, so I really can't complain. I'm sure maybe the paid ones are maybe a little bit less technical, but they can be a little tricky. So one of the first things I noticed is you can import or place an object, and you can place as many as you want. So in my case, I just placed them all at a time, and it saved me a lot of time. So in my case, I had scale figures and trees. But you'll notice when you click on an object, I can't really do anything to it. I can double click on it, and you know, the inside lines seem to be different from the outside lines and everything like that. I'll let that be up to you. I'm not a huge fan of putting more lines because it just means more detail where I don't want them to focus on that detail. I want them to focus on the architecture. So very often I take them off. However, since we're going to make it transparent anyway, you probably won't see them that much, and it might be a nice subconscious difference. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it, but you'll notice that it's actually two different objects. So in my case, if I release this mask, nothing happens. But you'll notice that there's actually this magic box around it. It happens twice though. So you'll notice if I just highlight that box and press delete, oh, it accidentally gets rid of that one. And you'll notice it's still a grouped object. In fact, I'll just put it over here for a second so that I can work with this one. All right, so for instance, maybe I want to turn it green, things like that, but you'll notice nothing happens, right? And it's because it's locked into this, honestly, I don't know, but I do know how to get out of it. Or at least what to call it. I don't know what to call it, but I do know it's in some sort of mode. So in our case, you'll click on it and you'll constantly release it or ungroup it, right? And you'll see that, well, it basically falls apart, right? You keep clicking on it, ungroup. Keep clicking on it until you notice that there's nothing else to do about it, right? And in fact, that's when you can click on it and of course change the color, right? And you'll start to actually reveal how it's made a little bit better, the way that it was traced and the way that somebody is actually making these, which again teaches you a lot about the program. Now we could make it a solid color. I think that's okay. But I did want to show you a couple of things about gradients just because I think there's a really easy way to mess up gradients. And arguably I achieved some things that I normally would say don't use gradients, and it ended up okay. So I did want to show that. We can take that piece, and instead of a full color, we'll click on this middle button called gradient. So when you click on that, it'll actually bring up this gradient toolbox. What's nice is we can edit that gradient. So if you edit it, you can actually change the direction or the amounts or things like that. And you'll notice there's an endpoint and that it even turns into a rotation. For the most part, I would actually stick to the direction that I made my shadows. Obviously, I'm going to want some darkness on this side because I chose that my shadows go this way. Obviously, don't choose the opposite because now your shadows and your lighting doesn't look right. So in my case, I just kind of want to set it up, right? Make sure that I get the angle and that the darkness of my tree is at the bottom, right? So in my case, yeah, some of these points are pretty hard to select. You kind of have to wait until it gives a lot of visual indicators for sure. But for the most part, we set up that first. That way we can click on these little dots and add some color. Now, what I noticed, I was showing you guys all those swatch tools, but there's a lot of color schemes for this as well. So I immediately went to nature and I went to foliage, right? Because immediately there was actually a bunch of predetermined color choices that I had, and I was like, well, look at that one. That looks actually similar to the color scheme that I would use in architecture, right? So why not use it, right? Obviously, I want some brightness toward the top, so I'll choose this color and make sure that it's my brighter color. I'll go to my darker side, and I don't want to get too dark, right? So don't get me wrong, it still looks a little plasticky, right? But we can manipulate it obviously a lot more too. Usually I like lighter trees and really to kind of get that shadow quality towards the bottom of the tree, right? I'll go ahead and click out of it, right? So using my direct tool and keep it. Now keep in mind that these are other pieces. So I'd basically have to just change this to open, right? So in my case, also the line as well. And I may actually have to change it to the background. So I'll want to keep those. And you start to realize why some of these are grouped the way that they are. I can bring my lines back if I want to. So again, take this piece. Pretty sure it'll take the whole thing. I'll hold shift so, it matches pretty well. Not too bad. To be fair, not bad, right? I mean, it is way too saturated, but once we take that in, so I'll Command C, copy, and paste it. Of course, I want to make sure that I'm on the right layer because it will paste directly into that layer. So in my case, trees 2, press paste. I'm going to scale it down a little bit and keep it functional as well. And yeah, it's definitely competing with my architecture, so I'll take that piece and of course scale it back a lot. Not just the middle lines though. Again, this is probably why I should group those. Let's actually do that before I bring it in, just to show you how to do it. It is pretty simple. You just make that selection, you go down and you group it. And what is nice about that is no matter what you click on, that it's going to copy that whole thing or that whole group. So I'll paste it, and not looking too shabby. Now we can see through it a little bit more, and we can further use it. And to be fair, it starts to look really nice, right? Not competing with the architecture too much. To be fair, that's a very big tree. I mean, it's literally 5 stories tall, so let's scale that back a little bit. And again, I love the copying process. Now, I wouldn't do this though, right? I accidentally have my clouds. Again, why I like to lock everything now. Found it very useful. But I can immediately actually put the trees towards the back of the architecture too. I don't have to worry about, the architecture coming up, except on this layer that seems to be transparent. But you can see the brick is covered, right? But not so much on this piece. So we'll talk about that. Also could just delete it from this tree. So I could just take, the tools, keep it there. Now, I don't know if it works on a group object. Let's find out actually. Hey, works on a grouped object. How about that? So yeah, pretty easy to make stuff look behind it. But right now it looks really fake. I mean, no trees are actually the same, so you'd at least want to like add some differences to the trees, right? Even that, like you're like, oh, those couldn't be the same tree, right? And to be fair, you could also take this too, and change it, so transform, like reflect it a little bit, and make it go the other way, make it a little bit smaller. Could obviously use different trees as well. But I don't know, I kind of like this little overlap effect. If you don't like it though, you can always delete it from one of the trees. So for instance, you're basically deciding which tree is, behind or in front. So in my case, I'm going to decide that this one's behind. I'm going to double click so I can, only focus on this guy. But the selection tool is really nice, right? I can go in here and just basically delete the ones that I don't need. So I'm going to delete all the ones, or as you can see, there's thousands of points in here. So I don't want to make this too hard on myself, right? And kind of just delete accordingly, right? I may actually need to draw some more lines, right? So I'll use my pen tool or the letter P, right? And of course can add those points in. Doesn't want me to. I guess I actually have to select the line. Or maybe it's because it's a grouped object, is actually what I'm finding to be the case. But to be fair, we could probably see it a little bit more, right? And we still kind of see it. So clearly we need to, actually that's a good idea. I wonder if you can erase it. Anyway, there's also a knife tool, a scissors tool, because the scissor tool is kind of pretty neat. It basically works like the erase tool, but cuts specifically, similar to the pencil in the way that it draws. So kind of sketchy. Let me show you that real quick. As soon as I remember where the scissors are. If this were my house, I would just, open up the junk drawer, and there'd be like 8 scissors right there. Does everybody else have a junk drawer at home? Good, it's not just me. Anyway, you can look into the scissors tool for yourself, but it really isn't that difficult. But arguably starts to really get something across, and a lot of manipulability, right? We can get those trees closer to the ground. We can see that they're behind the ramp and things like that, and we can even start to see some of the foreground and background within that foreground, sorry. Right, really starting to get somewhere, right? It's starting to look like this architecture is placed somewhere, that it tells a story. And right now it tells a story for no one because nobody's there. So of course the last thing that we need is some people. So in my case, I put some people last night. Let's turn my shadows back on.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can we, how do you say, when you kind of like take the building off so you can see behind it, and then do the background, and then have the building background?
Mm-hmm.
Can we do that?
I'm just doing that with the layers. So if you check this out, Leo, I can turn all these off, and I can just work on the background or that specific layer, right? So, I can turn the ground layer off, I can turn the shadows off. You can turn everything off, right? I mean,
Once you do like the background and then you have to turn the building back on, how do you make it so it's like a line and it just doesn't look like two transparent layers on top of each other?
That's what I was just covering.
Oh.
Right, so you can delete from one object instead of the other.
For the points?
Yeah, the points itself with the direct tool. Yeah, absolutely refer back to that because it is a game changer. But to answer your question about like working on one at a time, you can definitely hide all these, right? And I would definitely encourage that because as you can see, these can get really complex really fast. But let's get some of my other pieces in there. The last thing I wanted to show today, and specifically actually, I know some of you guys are doing a night shot, so I wanted to show you that you can click on one, and one way to actually indicate that a light is on is to show some that are off, show that some that are on, right? So you don't necessarily want to turn them all on or keep them all off even, if that be the case. So I'm going to keep my shadows on, ground line, clouds number 2. We're definitely getting somewhere there. I have white scale figures right now because that's just kind of where I left them. But I need to go ahead and lock some of this other stuff because it looks like I'm still able to edit it. There we go. And you can kind of tell, once those layers are locked, it doesn't activate them or visually activate them. Those are starting to look pretty good. I got some shadow lines in there. Oh, I think those are my old shadows. My bad. Get those shadows out of there. Shadows number 2. There we go. But yeah, it even goes over the characters and people. If I didn't want that shadow to hit the people, like maybe I want the person to look like he's a little bit more above, I can of course take that person. Why is it giving me an edit box? Oh, because it's locked. My bad. My bad. Scale figures, scale figures. There we go. Sweet. Yeah, so you'll definitely start to see and indicate some stuff, right? But you don't necessarily have to like delete the shadow itself. In fact, you can just put it on a higher layer, right? Or you can right click and arrange and bring to the front, right? Now, if the layer, it won't override that fact about the layer, right? If the shadow's on top, the shadow's on top, right? This is really particularly for, the layer that this individual piece is on at the time. So in our case, if we want to get that past the shadows, I would need to put it like obviously on a layer that's above the shadows. And now immediately they look like they're sort of not close to the architecture, whereas some people are, some people aren't, right? In my case, it looks like I accidentally took all of them, so not a big deal. But what I was mentioning, of course, about this was specifically working on some of this scale figure information first here. That way you don't have to accidentally mess up your drawing or anything like that. So getting some people in there can be actually really easy. Again, it's the exact same process that we did with the trees, except, basically fixing it first. I'm going to put this old guy in there. He seems pretty cool. I'm going to copy him and, of course, paste him into my scale figures. So I'm just going to stay on my scale figures for today. And I want to show you how to put one in the window or possibly on top, right? Like this guy up here. So I'm going to paste. Dang, that's a giant guy. I'd also recommend pasting all of your scale figures at once. That way you can scale them all together at once as well. So I'm going to make it look like this guy's at the top. He's working hard on some architecture work. And maybe I want this specific window to be lit as well, because I can immediately turn this into a night scene, which is maybe how I end it today. So let's put him in the window. Maybe he's still kind of facing this direction. Obviously it looks like he's outside about to jump. Don't jump, man. Anyway, so let's take him. We'll isolate him, so we'll double click, use our direct tool, and we'll get rid of his legs. I know, poor guy. But we'll take those individual points again and just basically either we can bring the whole thing down, or you can, again, this is what's very difficult. You have to click on the point first to then drag it. Click on the point, then drag it. Anyway, very annoying. But it is what it is. Double click out of it, and he starts to actually look a little bit more inside, right? To be fair, still not quite much. Can't really see him so much, so maybe we actually turn him white so that we can see him a little bit better. Still kind of looks like he's outside though, so maybe we actually change the window up. So in my case, I could change all the windows at once as long as they're not locked. Alright, so one thing that is pretty nice, of course, about having layers is you can further change something, right? We can go with sky windows, where it's reflecting that blueness of the sky even. And again, that would make a lot of sense when we don't have any sky. To again go, okay, the wonderful blue like glass. And again, layers save your day. Because, you know, you have one studio comment to ruin your day during studio, right? I mean, the professor comes by and goes, I hate your windows. So you print out 3 new ones with 3 different windows and be like, okay, which windows do you like, and things like that. But let's say I had that kind of situation. Maybe I'm going for a night shot. Ooh, kind of purpley. Again, sometimes I like just going like this. There's a whole party in there. Anyway, I don't know. I kind of like the red in there. There's so many different schemes and styles that we can choose, and that's really actually the hard part, is picking something that you honestly prefer or like, and then, of course, to try to make it first. I kind of like this blue today, so I'll keep that. But you can also select them individually. In his case, up at the top, maybe we select that one. I like to double click because it helps me kind of focus a little bit better. But maybe I change it to a lighter yellow situation. And maybe a brighter. Right, maybe the light's on. Right, things like that. Doesn't look so good during the day, and to be fair, you can't really see the light during the day. So in my case, maybe blue's not the best for our background. But let's go ahead and change this background. And in my case, I may need to draw one or just make one really easily. So I'm going to stay in my background layer, and I'm just going to make a shape. Oh. And I do have to be able to see the layer. So I'm just going to delete my sky for now. It's kind of getting in the way. I'm going to go ahead and make just a big piece. It's an instant Fallout city, right? Nobody plays Fallout? All right. Anyway. Obviously don't want that color. I'm going to go with maybe a gradient. And now that I know how to change it. All right, we'll go with actually maybe a darker blue towards the top. And you can lengthen these too. But for the most part, you know, you can control it quite a bit. So instead of black, because we don't need black skies, you know, let's go with something a little bit more purpley. It is a night shot. Maybe it's about to be the sunset, so maybe I want some orange in there. Maybe it fades to like a light blue. So we do have to be a little bit artistic about it. Right? It's a little bit much on the orange, so I can use these little pieces at the top to actually control that a little bit more, if I want to. You know, it's a little bit harsher. And to be fair, maybe maybe have a little less yellow in there, a little bit more purple and darks. So something I definitely wanted to show Leo, since he was really keen on trying to get that that night shot. Right, so there's a little bit of rich blues, purples, things like that. And we can really dial that stuff in. Now, obviously, that's way too saturated right now, but it's a start. So that we can take this piece, go back to our direct tool, take that piece, and bring it back. Starts to look like a night shot. And we, for more or less, start to think that, you know, at least it's addressing that. Now, I'd probably want to make my windows darker and really overall my architecture darker if that were the case. So, again, honestly, a simple fix. Take all the windows, change their colors. Now, in my case, I'll want to unselect the one that I have changed. So I'll hold Shift and click it, and you'll see that it goes back to that all color. So in my case, maybe it's like a really dark, and that one's not too shabby. It's kind of blending in with that yellow too much, but hey, you know, it is what it is. I can also, again, if I didn't like the color, change it. Right? Maybe it's a little bit brighter, maybe it's a little more yellow, not sure. Again, I would refer to actually something that you do like, again. Sweet. And maybe we fade him out a little bit more because he still looks like he's outside, so. Sweet. Not too shabby. But arguably, a lot of things are pretty nice about Illustrator now that I mention it, right? The ability to draw, the ability to change things really quickly, and of course, the ability to copy stuff on an instant, right? You know, say I needed more people and things like that, or just wanted to make some white, some black, so that they stand out a little bit more, I could. Of course, the last thing that it needs is maybe a scale figure or two. And to be fair, there's even more that I want to show you, so I'll leave it to a part 3. Any questions on this so far, guys? Hopefully helpful? Sweet.